Good morning. It's a wet morning, but it's in many ways, a beautiful morning as you can almost hear the dry earth sucking in the moisture that has fallen. And I realized as I looked yesterday afternoon out across the vista from my deck and then looked again this morning, there has been quite a greening going on. Just with that little bit of rain, all of those early breaking forth of buds and whatnot just seem to have enhanced overnight with the rain, and it's just this marvelous vista of green wherever you look. And it's wonderful to see that happening. This past week, the world celebrated Earth Day, and we are reminded that as people of faith that the earth is part of the creation that God has given to us, blessed us with, and we are mandated and called upon to do our part in caring for it. And so as we come this morning to share the word, we begin to unpack the story of Christ, and we begin to continue this journey of wanting to walk with Christ, but also in these Easter Sundays, these Sundays following the Easter event, we look at the lectionary texts that bring to us the story. And this morning I've entitled my sermon, "The Heart of the Matter," and I thank Connie for getting very creative with the bulletin this week and placing the heart there in place of the word. On the walk back from the now empty tomb and her encounter in the garden with the risen Christ, we can only imagine the jumble of thoughts, the images, and the emotional ideas that were swirling in the head of Mary of Magdala. What had just happened to her? Who was this person? Alive, dead, and alive again. Who was the teacher who had healed her, traveled with her, and who now told her to speak to the other disciples of his rising? And soon her friends, Jesus' companions, were asking those same questions. How can we understand? How can we speak to others of our rabbi? Well, we know from our understanding and having the scriptures readily before us to read and to learn from that Peter has already declared that their teacher, Jesus, was the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But clearly Peter had not fully understood what that meant. Indeed, pretty much all of the disciples were still in a bit of a fog. Peter did not realize that to be the Messiah was to be the one who would lay down his life, undergoing great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests, killed and raised. And when Peter had tried to silence Jesus, when Jesus tried to tell them that this was what was going to happen, he found himself being rebuked and silenced. And in these Sundays after Easter, which we call Eastertide or the Sundays of Easter, we have looked at some of the upper room encounters that Jesus had in the risen form with his followers. We've looked at Thomas, and last week at the disciples gathered there in the upper room. But in all of those texts, we do not read about joy and excitement and and just wonderful companionship and everything that should be there, because the master who was dead is now alive. What we read and the words described are words like doubting and frightened and troubled, even as Jesus stood in the midst of them and showed them all his wounds. There was still this level of amazement, but almost a frightened, not fully understanding. And now, on this fourth Sunday of Easter, the gospel reading shifts from this historical recounting of what I've always called the post-resurrection appearances, but this historical recounting of the events following the resurrection. The passage in the gospel shifts from that to a Christological focus, which is, it begins to go back and look at who this person Jesus was and what he did and his teachings. And so this shift now becomes a totally different focus. We're not walking with the risen Christ this Sunday. We're back to some of his most profound and deep teachings. And the goal is to assist us as we, like Mary and the disciples, seek to understand what happened and what is happening to us, the flock of the Good Shepherd. So we read this morning from John's Gospel, the 10th chapter, 11 through 18. I, Jesus said, am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. And they too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life only to take it up again. And no one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. In the years and the decades and the centuries to our own time, the followers of Jesus have sought for the ways of how to express in words and images who was and who is this person, Jesus. John, for example, opened his gospel account with this grand vision of the one who was before all time and through whom all things came into being. Jesus was the very Word of God made flesh. And they turned to the images Jesus had taught them about himself. He told them that he was the vine, and they were the branches. He told them that he was the bread of life and living water that would quench their thirst forever. And he taught them that he was their shepherd, and they were his flock. The Good Shepherd discourse, or at least the idea of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, is one of John's especially memorable moments that at times tends to be remembered out of context. One of the many crises of this past year has been the crisis of authority. As conflicting news reports and scientific studies and expert voices have told us how to manage the challenges of COVID and racism and global warming and political wrangling, many of us have grown weary, suspicious, even cynical. Whose guidance, whose leadership can we trust? Who will tell us the truth? Whose voice should we listen to? In our text for this fourth Sunday in Easter, we see a version of leadership quite different from the ones we're used to in politics and the media. John describes a leader who lays down his life not with words, but with costly actions. A leader who literally places his body in harm's way for the sake of those he leads. This is a leader with integrity. This is a leader with courage. This is a leader with skin in the game. A leader who is self-sacrificially good. Now, for many of us who have grown up in the church, this story is a familiar one. And it certainly can have this sort of warm, gentle glow of safety and warmth about it. As you probably learn very early on about this leader, Jesus, the Good Shepherd, before perhaps some of us could even walk, we learn this story and the images. Maybe there was a painting of the gentle-faced Jesus in the nursery we were part of growing up. This gentle-faced Jesus with this adorable lamb wrapped around his neck. Maybe you made sheep out of toothpicks and cotton balls with gluing them together. And maybe, although this is dating myself, you may remember a teacher who moved a felt shepherd across a green flannelgraph dotted with fleecy lambs. Debbie Thomas muses in a writing on the Journey with Jesus website. She muses, I don't think I'm the only one who finds the Good Shepherd passages in John's Gospel difficult. And though I long for the trustworthy leadership that John describes via this metaphor, I'm not sure how to apply a shepherd to my 21st century life. The image is overfamiliar. Its beauty buried under so much syrupy piety and greeting card sentiment. I'm not sure what to do with it. Most of us have no real life idea what Jesus was talking about when he described the life of faith in terms of shepherds and sheep and hirelings and wolves. The images we hold in our heads aren't substantive and gritty. They're momentary and soft like watercolors. Now, this discourse actually emerges out of a massive conflict. with the religious authorities. We go back to chapter 9 to find that story unfolding, and chapter 10 is a continuation of all that has gone on. The conflict and the related discourses are actually flanked by attempts to stone Jesus in John chapter 8 and at the end of John chapter 10. John 10 begins in the middle of a quotation that has started at John 9 and verse 41. Jesus is continuing a conflict with the religious authorities which they have started. With the man born blind after Jesus has restored the man's sight. And what was most important to the authorities was he did it on the wrong day. That's all that mattered. Jesus did it on the wrong day. And when the authorities cast the man out, Jesus finds him and receives him as his own, his sheep, in the symbolic landscape of John chapter 10. The man born blind receives not only physical sight, but also spiritual insight. While Jesus tells the powerful opponents that in their insistence that they are able to see, they remain blind, spiritually blind. He illustrates the conflict of John 9 and John 10 with the contrasting images of the true good shepherd on the one hand and the thieves and the bandits who oppose him on the other, the false shepherds who do not enter the sheepfold by the gate but climb in by another way. They do not have the best interests of the sheep at heart. They steal, they kill, they destroy, while Jesus, who is metaphorically both the door to the sheepfold and the shepherd of the sheep, offers abundant life. And as our passage for this Sunday begins, we learn and we hear it again and again in these verses that the goodness of the true shepherd comes at a cost. While the hired hand who does not care for the sheep because they are not his own, he runs away when the wolves come. The shepherd does not. The good shepherd lays down his life. It's a phrase that's repeated 5 times in these verses. I look at this story, and for me, I see 2 very contrasting stories happening within it. There's the Pharisees, the keepers of the law, the righteous. They understood their responsibility. They had the law, and they had the responsibility to judge, to decide, and to take appropriate action. And the blind man was just another case study for them to evaluate and to pass judgment, which they did. Banished them. But in contrast, stark contrast, Jesus saw the blind man as a human being. He saw the need. You know, it's interesting. Jesus didn't ask questions about sin and parents and history and prospects. He didn't even ask the man, "Don't you know what day it is? I can't do this." None of those questions. Jesus saw a man that was obviously in need, and he helped. he helped. And the help in this case was healing, restoring sight. What is better? Asked Eugene Peterson. What is better? To be perfectly right and never have a black mark against you all your days, and to be able to stand before God and say, you can't find a thing against me. Or to plunge into loving, caring relationships with God and others with all the difficulties involved. What is better? What is better? Jesus is saying it is better to be compassionate than to be right. It is better to be compassionate than to be right. Jesus was compassionate. This loving way is a scenario that John places before us when he tells the story of Jesus defining himself as the Good Shepherd. You see, at the very heart of this text is love. The very heart of this text is love. It is because of love that the Good Shepherd lays down his life. Where others may depart, the Good Shepherd stays because of care. And there is knowing between the Good Shepherd and his own. I know my own, and my own know me. This is the son of a carpenter. A man who certainly attracted fishermen to his following. Talking about being a farmer. Metaphors and mixing. What's clear is that he was a laborer. He's speaking the language of people who are manual workers, speaking the language of the families of people who knew there's no reward without sweat and long hours and drudgery of work, rhythms that ask much of you in many weathers and demand. And into this context of manual work, Jesus speaks about love. This is a demand, and it is a making public of the value of love. At the heart of Jesus' words here is a depiction of a man who was keen to speak to his friends that it was love. It was love that was driving him to say brave things in public, things that would eventually attract the attraction of power and would then seek to end his life. And somehow too, he had ended up listening to a love that he believed would sustain him through that. I want to this morning just make two very simple observations or actions that I see in this text for us. The first is that Jesus knows us as persons. Jesus knows me and you as a person. He knows our names. He knows our needs. He sees us as wonderfully complex creations of a living God. He sees us as having the imprint of God in us. And we are not pawns moved about a chessboard. We are not defined by our places in the social system. We are unique and infinitely worth knowing. And because he knows us, Jesus trusts us to know him, to know God. And the second observation is the call to recognize that resurrection life is not just a gift for personal blessing. but it is a powerful energy that is intended to flow between people, bringing life, bringing wholeness, bringing justice wherever it flows. As such, the call to love one another sacrificially applies not just to those in leadership, but to every Christ follower. The resurrection life we celebrate is meant to connect us with others and motivate us to seek their best, contributing in whatever way we can to a world of grace and peace and justice and love as we seek to live Christ's resurrected life together. Our care and our compassion has the potential to address every crisis that we have on this planet. From the lostness of our world, the poverty, the climate change, and everything in between. All that it takes is the vision and the hope, the courage and the commitment and the faith to follow the movement of God's Spirit and the life that God's Spirit brings. As John writes the story of Jesus, his intent is that we should realize personally that this is what is intended for each of us. Knowing God, being known by God. Jesus insists on our knowing Him as well as He knows us. This is what it means to live a complete life, a good life. The story of the Good Shepherd is one of John's best, and as we grow and develop as persons, individuals of character and goodness, we are influenced, whether we are aware of it or not. We are influenced by models, and we often assimilate those models into our everyday behavior. And Jesus is the best model that we can follow. Not just bits and pieces of what He taught and showed, but all of it. All of it. And as we leave this virtual gathering, wherever we may be connecting this morning, I share these challenging words of Eugene Peterson. They challenged me and continue to challenge me every day. That we would leave claiming Jesus, the Good Shepherd, as the model on how we are going to live our lives as good shepherds, as little Christs, who become interested in the people around us as persons, not problems, not projects, not puzzles, but persons we will look to serve, to lay down our lives for. It's too much to expect, perhaps. But not too much to ask as you imagine the life of Christ the Shepherd being worked into the very fabric of our minds and bodies. And that is the heart of the matter. Let us pray. Good Shepherd, teach us to follow you, to care for all that are close to us, to protect those who are threatened, to welcome those who are rejected, to forgive those who are burdened by guilt, to heal those who are broken and sick, to share with those who have little or nothing, to take the time to really know one another and love as you have loved us. Good Shepherd, teach us to follow you, to spread compassion to those who are far away, to speak for those who are voiceless, to defend those who are oppressed and abused, to work for justice for those who are exploited, to make peace for those who suffer violence, to take the time to recognize our connectedness, and to love as you have loved us. Good Shepherd, teach us to follow you and to be faithful to the calling you gave us to be shepherds in your name. Amen.